Shiva Oil Paint Stick, and I have a black one and I have a blender, and I removed the skin off of it, and then I sliced off a few pieces of the paint, and then I added a small amount of the blender. And then you can do this with your X-Acto knife, or you can do it with even a plastic spoon instead of a palette knife if you don't have one. And you can just mix this until the blender is mixed in with the paint. Now you don't want to add too much blender, you just want to add enough so that it will make your paint nice and smooth. And once you have it a nice smooth consistency that you can work with, then you can come back as I did, and I took the paint off the brush, and then I just have some here, and I have it worked into my small 1/8" stencil brush. The next thing I did to make my bees is I found the position of where my bee was supposed to be on my background block. And I ironed a piece of freezer paper to the back of it where at the place where I'm going to be stenciling the bee. Now I'm going to take my stencil brush, and stenciling is just pounding. So you want to make sure that you have enough paint on your brush so that it gets into these small little crevices. Now you don't want to rub back and forth, because what's going to happen is that will make you lift up your freezer paper stencil. For those of you who are in the class, I've cut these out for you. And to make that stencil, you need to have a cutting machine to make this stencil. Now I'm ready to stencil this, so I'm just going to pound up and down, and you can see lightly. I can have it shaded lightly if I want. Now if I'm doing this on my block, and I did mine on my block after I had all the applique sewn on the block. Now it was kind of scary at first on the first one because you've got all that sewing done, so you want to make sure that you know how to do it. So I did samples just like I'm doing right here on a piece of material, and then when I'm working on my regular block, I take some extra pieces of freezer paper and put around here just to make sure that nothing flips up off the brush and gets on my background. So I'm just continuing to pound this in here lightly and stencil color in, and I want to make sure I have all of the areas of the stencil. You can see how it's getting a little bit darker over here on this one, and how the foot part of the leg just kind of came into view. It doesn't really take you that long, and when you'll know when you have all of your little legs filled in, because you can actually see the actual little tiny part of his foot come in. But I like it to be a nice dark color. I want it to show up. It's really fine detail, and I just like the way it looks, and that's the only real reason why I want to do this. Now I normally let this dry for a minute before I remove my stencil, but you can take it off right away. But you want to make sure that you have everything stenciled exactly the way you want it. So you want to have all the little areas filled in. And like I said, put more freezer paper around your little stencil. That way you won't get anything on your finished block. And I'm just going to peel this up. And now there's the reveal. There is my bee's body, head, and antenna, legs. I mean, not body. There is his legs and his head and his little antennas. So that's how I made those, and it's a very strong color, fine detail for a little tiny item on your finished quilt. So we'll continue, and I've had mine cut out of freezer paper, 2 layers. And you're going to want to iron this onto the silk velvet. If you're going to be using the silk velvet or regular fabric, you're going to iron it on to the wrong side of the fabric. Now you'll do this just like you do any other applique shape. We're just going to iron it to the wrong side of the fabric, and then we would cut it out. And you're going to cut it out with a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And you especially want to have a smaller seam allowance right here at the little head, because it's very small, and you need to make sure that you can get all of that seam allowance turned without it being way too bulky. Now you also need to clip right here at the neck, and you're going to clip right here on the opposite side. And I would like to make sure that I have this trimmed as close as I can so that I still have a nice seam allowance to work with. Now we're going to do this just as we always do. We're going to be using starch, and I'm going to apply my starch, and I always start with the head facing away from me so that I can take care of that head part first, because it's the smallest, hardest spot. If you feel like your piece is going to move on you, you can always put a pin in the center of your template here so that you can work with this and not have to worry about chasing your template around the ironing mat. Now I'm just pulling up my seam allowance up over the edge. Now you want to make sure that your seam allowance is damp, because the starch is what's going to hold the seam allowance nice and flat. And as I always do, I use a non-aerosol starch, and I put it in my starch brush, or I can use a stencil brush and I'll put it in a small container. But I like the starch brush. All I need to do is just squeeze it, and it applies the starch directly to the area that I want, and then I'm going to come around and I will continue ironing. Now that little angle at the neck is one that I try to make sure that I have a nice indent in there. So now that I've gone around both of those sides of the head there, I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to see, did I get a nice indentation in there? Now your velvet gets somewhat flattened out at this point, but don't worry about it. It will pop right back up and it'll be just as fluffy as you want it. And that's why I wanted to use it, because these bodies, when you look at them up close, they kind of look kind of fuzzy and hairy, and especially bumblebees, and these are big bumblebees. So now I'm going to finish my little bee body here, and I'm going to continue all the way around until I have the whole body turned. And in this case, it's kind of deceiving because you have fuzziness around the edge, but whether you actually have it pulled up tight, but you can feel your seam allowance touching the edge of your template really easily. So don't worry about that. But once I have it all ironed, here's my little bee. And he has a little fuzzy piece sticking out over here, and I think that's fuzz, but I'm not sure, so I want to touch it with just a little bit of starch and pull that back in just to make sure that I have that roundness of his head that I would like to have. Now this body is ready to go on to your background. Now I'm going to hit this with my iron and make sure that my seam allowance starch is dry. And once it's dry, and I think I need a little bit more starch right here, and it may be because I didn't starch that good enough, but we're just going to come back, and we want that seam allowance to stay nice and flat. And that's much better. So now that that's nice, then this piece is ready to be set aside, because we're going to iron all of our bodies, and you need 12 of them for your quilt. Whether you're doing them with the velvet or you're doing them with fabric, you'll need 12 bees, unless you decide to not do that many. And then we're going to set these aside along with our stenciled piece that we have here, where I'm going to be doing my example. So now we have our legs, head, and antenna stenciled on our fabric. We have our body prepped, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to assemble our wings before we sew anything on. So we'll get to that in just 1 second. Okay, we're ready to make the wings now. Now the wings are made of 1.5 inch organza. It comes on a roll. And we want to use 1 3/4 inch piece of organza. Now it's very pliable and it moves a lot, and I did use my rotary cutter and a ruler so that I had straight edges on here. So I don't want any excess fabric in here, so I'm trying to keep it as square as possible. Now I'm taking my 1 3/4 inch piece and I have folded it in half. And as you can see, I have a little storyboard thing going here because it's very hard for you to see this when I'm doing it because my fingers are holding everything. And I'm going to cut this in half. And now we have the pieces for 2 wings. The next step is here, and what we're going to do with this is we're going to fold our piece in half. And we want to keep our raw edge out here. I mean, not our raw edge, our finished edge out here, our raw edge in towards our hand. I folded it in half. It doesn't really keep a crease, but you kind of know where it is. And I'm folding the upper edge back over here 1/4 inch past my center line. And I will do the same thing with the opposite side. And this is why I have the storyboard laid out here. It should look like this. So 1/4 inch past center on each of those. And when you turn this over, you'll notice that you have the straight edge. So that straight edge is actually the finished edge of our piece. So you always want to be mindful that everything you're doing when you're taking your stitches is just 1/8 inch in from that straight edge. And that's why I have my fingernail here and I'm holding that so I know that that's my finished edge. The next step is to fold this another time. So now I'm going to take this and I'm going to fold it towards the center, and I'll fold this one towards the center. So this piece here should be around 3/8 of an inch. It shouldn't be a 1/2 inch. It should be at 3/8 of an inch, or just a scant less. You don't want it too bulky because we need to gather this. Now I took an 18-inch piece of thread. I folded it in half. I threaded both ends of the thread through the eye of the needle so that I had a loop on the end here. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I can reduce all the bulk in here, as much bulk in here as possible. So I'm threading this, I'm going through my loop, and now I'm making a secure knot at this end. Now it only takes 3 stitches to gather this. So I'm going in one time all the way to the back. I come up, that's my second stitch. I go down near the edge, that's my third stitch. It's 3 stitches to gather this section, and that's what we're doing on this next piece right here, is we're making our gathers. So now I'm going to pull this through, and I'm going to pull it as tight as I can. And so you can see it starts to form the wing. Now I can turn this around and I'm going to go underneath the edge and I'm going to go back 1, 2, and come out at my beginning. And this way I can have a nice secure edge on that end. I will take this and I'm going to take 2 to 3 tiny little whip stitches right next to each other. 1, 2, 3. And then the last thing I did is I will, so get a pin also. These things are so small, they move around so easily. A little gust of wind and your wing will be off in the air. Now if you can divide this thread, would be a nice thing. The last thing I want to do is I want to tie a couple of knots, and that's why the thread is so long, so that I can easily do this. So 1, 2. I just want to make sure that when I cut my threads that my knot isn't going to come out. So now that I have that done, your wing looks like this. The next thing that you want to do is from the back side, you can see slightly where, or you can actually feel it better, is where the raw edge of that straight edge on the back of this ribbon is. So you want to trim that, and that gives you about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then what you have is you have a wing ready to go. Now you'll need 2 wings for each bee, so you'll end up making 24 of these. A little tedious, but they're well worth the look. So I'll come back in a second and we'll talk about sewing the bee. We are ready to assemble our bee. And one thing that you are going to need is a little bit of stuffing. Now you don't need very much at all, and what I have here is probably a little bit too much. So I'll be showing you what to do with that in the end. We have 2 wings, and we have our body, and we have our background piece. Now if you let your paint dry for about 24 hours, and then you want to hit it with iron to heat set it. And I would just put a napkin, a piece of fabric, a piece of paper over the top of this. My iron is on high, and you can see that nothing came off here. But when I was doing the other bee, you can see that there was some residue from the paint that came off on my paper. So you can just continue to iron that to make sure that nothing comes off. Once you do that and you can't see anything, you know that that paint is set in that fabric. Now I have a needle already threaded here and ready to go, and we are going to take our body and we will place it on our legs, and we're just going to have the body part up here at the top just barely touching the black. We just want to overlap it just slightly. And because everything is so small, we're just going to pin this. I'm not going to glue this. I found that it was things shift because this is very pliable, the velvet. So it just makes it easier if you can move it around with your needle as opposed to having it glued and trying to unglue it. So now I'm starting up here on my right side and at the neck, and I will sew around to the other side of the neck over here. And I need to straighten out my piece. Even though this isn't going on my quilt, I still want it to be a nice example. So we're going to start stitching, and the nice thing about the velvet is you don't really have to worry very much about your stitch as long as you're using the same matching thread, because the thread will bury itself into the nap of the velvet. It just kind of disappears in there, so you don't really have to worry. You just have to make sure that you are actually catching the edge of the inside the edge of the fabric and not just the fuzz that's poking out in the velvet. But you do want to make sure that you have the stitch. Now I'm coming around to the opposite side of my bee at his neck area. I guess they have a neck, at least mine do anyway. And I like to take 2 stitches right there. And I just want to take 2 stitches so that I can make sure that I have that secure, because now what I want to do is I need to insert one of my wings. Now your wings go on here with this folded opening facing up, not upside down. I want to see that that fold in there. So at this point I do remove my pin, and I'm just going to lift this up, and I'm going to place my wing in there. Now you can pin this if you like. I just found for myself that it was a little cumbersome trying to pin it, trying to hold everything together. So I opted to just hold this. Now, one thing I did do is I did pin my body out here just to keep that straight. And I'm going to start stitching. Now the stitching, I'm going to start here on the edge, and I'm going down through the wing and straight down. And when I'm stitching this, I'm going straight down and straight up. Did I go around that? That's one thing you don't want to do. You don't want to get your thread looped around your wing. Okay, and then I'm going to come straight up, but this time I'm coming up into the velvet area. And when I go back down, so we're doing a stab stitch here. I just found that it was easier to do the stitch this way than it is to try and do a one stitch from the top. Now at this point, if you like, you can actually, and I see mine's coming out. Let me get my pressing tool over here, and I'm just going to tuck this back under there. Come on. Get back under there. There we go. But I also want to kind of condense my wing slightly if you can. I just thought it made it a little bit more, I don't know, gathered looking by doing that. So I just tried to push the wing together just a little bit more. Let me move that mat out of the way. It's getting in my way of my stitching. And I'm going to come up, and on my last stitch over here, I'm going to bring in this corner that wants to just keep coming out. So you can see I have problems too. So I'm going to tuck that in there, and then I'm going to stitch that baby down as quickly as I can. Yeah, it's harder to go in and out, but it's easier for me to hold that wing in position. So now that I have this wing secured, I'm going to take another stitch right here on this end to make sure that it's stitched down exactly the way I want it. And I will come over here, and I'll continue sewing around my bee, but I'm going to stop when I get to the first leg on the other side. So I'm not going all the way up to the area where I'll be inserting the wing. I'm stopping ahead of that. Okay, I'm going to come over here. I really like how intense the black color is on the stenciled legs, and that's why I do it. And it doesn't bleed like if we were trying to ink this. Now you can embroider these. You can use your stencil, and you can just iron it in place, and you can take a pencil and you can mark your stitching lines if you want to stitch with the instead of doing the inking. You can actually use a stencil, draw one line, and then you can go back and you can ink your lines with a Pigma pen. But when you're inking with the Pigma pens, it does have a tendency to bleed slightly. And what I like about the wings is how they just jump up off of the block, and they look so dimensional. So I'm coming around, and I'm going to take some bigger stitches than I normally would, but I'm going to get up here so that we don't have to watch me stitch this. And okay, so I'm here, and then what I'm going to do, now this takes, oh, what happened to my other wing? Where did you go? Oh, there you are. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to insert my second wing on the opposite side. Now this time I am going to pin this because I want to stuff my bee body, and I'm going to get this in place. I'm going to pin through my wing, and I'm going to try to come up slightly onto its body unit there. So I'm holding that in place. Now I'm going to take a little tiny bit of batting, and I want the back part of his body to be kind of mounded. I just thought that they would look better if they had a little dimension to them. Now you can leave them flat if you like, but I want mine to look like they're actually landing on this block. And when I show you the finished piece, you'll see what I mean. Now I'm just taking this little batting and I'm just putting it in here. Now the other reason to do this is the black stripes on the bee are just straight stitches. They're just a straight stitch. So by having this extra little puffiness in here, when I take that straight stitch across there, it actually gives it a little bit more dimension. So it's just the slightest amount of stuffing, and it is kind of hard to get it in there. It's so tiny. I didn't want to you don't want to really make a ball of it and try to shove the whole ball in there, because then it doesn't evenly distribute. But here you do want to. The other thing is I just put my pressing tool in my mouth and got the end of this damp, and that helps tuck under all those little fuzzies. So then come back to my needle, and I'm going to come back over here, and I will start stitching. Like I said, you don't have to be too careful on your edge, because your stitches will eventually just kind of blend into the fuzziness of the velvet. Now we're coming up to where my second wing is, and what I'm going to do when I get there is I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to take 2 stitches right here on this edge. I'm going to remove my pin, and then I'm going to go back to doing a stab stitch, down and up, down and up. And I really do quite a few of those when I'm actually working on my actual quilt block. But for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to do a couple so that you can see the stitches and how it and how I achieved this look. So I'm going to come back over here, and I would tie this off. And I think that you can see how dimensional the bee looks, and his body is rounded here on the top. And I'm just going to set this one aside, and I'm going to bring in one off of the actual quilt block from Friendly Forest. It's my new quilt pattern, and you will see the actual bees, and you can see how dimensional their body is. Now I just took 5 straight stitches across the body. I pulled them down slightly tight, and I will tell you, each bee comes out looking differently. I thought they were so much fun, and I do believe that they actually add that dimension that I was looking for. I wanted these bees flying around my little bear, and they take a little time to make, but they're a lot of fun. I hope this will help you when you make your bees, and keep stitching, and I look forward to seeing you on a video sometime. Thank you. Bye.